Right, everyone, welcome to Shadowproof. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and I'm managing editor, and I'm here with Branko Marcetic, who is the writer for Jacobin, and he's an In These Times fellow. He's also the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. Thanks for joining us, Branko.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
And so right now, I wanted to ask you. So we're putting together this video. I figure it's important to tell people when exactly we're doing this, so they can have the time, since things are really shifting as far as the election results. But we'll try to not get too specific about. I'm trying to. I wanted to talk to you about some of the more broader conclusions we can draw from the outcome in the election. But as of right now, as we're talking, it's just after 2 p.m. Eastern, and it looks like Joe Biden has a very slim path to 270. It also seems like Donald Trump has a very slim path to 270 in order to capture the electoral votes needed to win the presidency. At the same time, we're seeing results that suggest the Democrats didn't do as well down ballot in terms of capturing the Senate, and that they even underperformed in winning House races that they were after yesterday. So I invited you to. I wanted to speak to you because, for one, you wrote the book about Joe Biden. You know about many of his flaws, and the other thing is, I recall us having a bit of a back and forth back in the summertime around the conventions when, I think you had the same idea that basically the Democrats had made this decision that they were going to win this without the progressive left, that they believed that it was enough just to harness the Biden Republicans, as they were referring to them, which I think we now see are mostly non-existent, and that they were going to harness this like center. This magical center was going to be the place they would go to win the election. So I know you've been making some observations. What are your thoughts on this catastrophe in which we find ourselves?
Yeah, a catastrophe is a good way to put it. I mean, it's kind of the thing that I feared and kind of expected to happen based on the strategy that Biden was running. I was hoping that ultimately I would be proven wrong. I saw the polls and I thought, well, it can't be that they're actually more wrong than they were in 2016. That is exactly what happened. And while I am shocked at how wrong they were, I can't really say I'm totally surprised at this result, because what Biden did was, and what the Democrats did was, basically run the exact same campaign as 2016. A campaign that was that rested on pure anti-Trumpism, that had a very minimal vision and platform. Suddenly, a minimal kind of social democratic platform that they were putting forward to really explain to people how they're going to make their lives better. Really, basically no economic messaging whatsoever. They completely seared that ground, which ultimately it seems like that might have been the thing that really cost Biden, with Trump winning these voters that considered the economy the biggest issue. And as in 2016, again, trying to go for ex-Republicans, wealthier, better educated suburbanites, white people. And so what we have is this result that, from at least preliminary findings, based on the kind of counties that were won, and some of the exit polls that we've seen and other observations, it seems like the strategy that Biden has done, just running 2016 again with the hope that now this massive health and economic crisis is going to be enough to finally make anti-Trumpism alone big enough. What has that resulted in? It has resulted in Biden increasing his share of the white vote, particularly among those kind of suburbanites, and actually particularly among older people, so people over 65. I think that's where he made his biggest gains. But meanwhile, he has handed over a whole chunk of what used to be the Obama coalition over to Trump, which is amazing, given that Trump is the most openly racist president of the United States that we've seen suddenly since Reagan, possibly you could argue since Nixon. Trump overperformed among Latinos. He overperformed among African Americans, and the Latino vote in particular was key not just in Florida, where it almost certainly it sunk Biden because Biden did not get the Latino turnout that he was hoping for in Miami-Dade, but also just across the country. In Texas, there were counties that are over 90% Latino that Biden massively underperformed compared to Clinton. And that probably more than anything is what has really sunk him. But it's a product of that strategy, that same strategy that they tried in 2016, that every sort of centrist candidate tries against a hard right Republican every single time, and it always comes up short. And it may not come up short right now because of this crisis, but this should not be a close election. This should be a landslide. This should be a landslide along the lines of 1932 or even something like 1980. It's stunning that it is not.
Yeah, and it really seems like they placed a premium. We all did. I suppose I have to take responsibility here too for my attitude that the failure around handling COVID-19 would be enough for Democrats to cobble together a commanding victory. It just seemed to me logically that if you've got an unprecedented pandemic, at least as far as the last 100 years go, ripping through the country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and leaving them in economic duress, that they would blame the incumbent for it, and that the incumbent would pay the price for this happening on their watch, especially when it seems like it's clear that actions have been not taken by the Trump administration that could have helped out people. And yet somehow we don't have a clear message from the Democrats in the alternative that shows Biden would do any better. I mean, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean it's a stunning failure. It really is. This should have been a slam dunk. People talk about 2016 being the unlosable election, but I mean this really it was far more of an unlosable election. And really, it should have been, as I said before, a landslide. And I think part of that is, it for whatever reason, COVID was not as big of an issue as polling suggested, and as just common sense was suggested. I think there's several different theories that we can posit for that. I think one might be the fact that for so many people in this country and in the United States, they've been struggling for so long. They've been under the boot for such a long time that COVID doesn't feel like it's anything new. This is just one more calamity in a series of calamities. There's the fact that perhaps Trump's refusal to really deal with it for so long may have just kind of immunized people, not in the way that you would hope, but immunized them kind of politically and in terms of their anxiety about this crisis, because it's gone on for so long, it's dragged on for so long that people have just started to live with it, which is not what should happen. Of course, the virus should have been eliminated, or at least eliminated as much as could be. But it may be that people did ultimately what Trump was always saying that he wanted to do, which is just to have people live with it and get along with it. And perhaps another element of it is that because of the lack of help from the federal government, from Congress, the well-known failure to strike up another coronavirus bailout towards the end of this election cycle, that may have made people more concerned about the economy than the virus, because they were thinking about their jobs and thinking about their incomes. These are just theories, but I think it's key. It's clear that the economy was the biggest thing, and the fact that Biden and the Democrats were not able to make a strong economic message that countered Trump's, and also that they kind of dropped the ball in really tying him to the virus to some extent. You have to remember at the beginning, Biden tried to do this kind of civility approach where he said, I don't blame Trump for the virus. He stepped up his attacks as time went on, but he started by kind of saying, well, it's not, the virus isn't Trump's fault. It's what he did with it. But perhaps that sort of muddied the message a little bit. Who knows? Either way, I think ultimately this comes down to the lack of organization from the Democrats, and just the lack of strong messaging around several issues that were quarter people's concerns.
So in your thread that you have on your Twitter, and you're at B Marchetich, Marcetic, and so in your thread that you put together on this catastrophe that happened, you mentioned that it's an open secret that the Democratic upper echelon had little faith in Biden, and they were proven right, and yet they still preferred risking this than running an actual populist candidate on a social democratic platform. The greed and callousness of these people. So let's tackle the primary a little bit and how this fits into it. I mean, there were things from the primary that we saw about Biden's weaknesses, and then how did those specifically rear their ugly head in the general election and ultimately, in your view, affect the results? And again, we're drawing conclusions here that I think are going to stay the same regardless of whether the electoral college count works out in Biden's favor.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, despite his strong polling throughout 2019, Democrats were sometimes openly skeptical, even disdainful of Biden, due to his debate performances, due to his, let's say, lethargic campaign schedule during the primaries. People like Cory Booker said on live TV that they weren't sure if Biden was going to be able to carry the ball over the line. Julian Castro famously had that debate moment that he was savaged for by MSNBC and other cable news outlets, but he sort of suggested that Biden might have lost a step since his heyday, and he said, have you forgotten what you said just a couple of minutes ago? So people knew that Biden was having difficulties, various difficulties, that he was not quite the man that he was even as late as 2015. Certainly not when he was, in 2012 when he bested Paul Ryan in that year's vice presidential debate. And as we saw, through 2019, there was this movement of donors and voters. Even though Biden had a pretty solid base of support, the Democratic Party donors were not sold on him. He was not raising that much money. They were kind of jumping first from Kamala Harris, then to Elizabeth Warren for a time. There was Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. And then Biden obviously did terribly in the first two primary contests. He is the first Democratic nominee who has won the nomination after finishing, I think, third and fourth in the first two primary contests. That's never happened. And people obviously ruled him out until South Carolina. What was it that led Biden to end up the nominee, for people to coalesce around him? It wasn't because people thought he was a genius. As you know, there was this famous Politico report earlier this year that quoted Obama saying, don't underestimate, I don't know if I can swear here, but don't underestimate Joe's ability to...
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Don't underestimate Joe's ability to fuck things up, is reportedly what Obama said. He said this about a man that he ultimately moved heaven and earth behind the scenes to coalesce the Democratic Party around, to get Pete Buttigieg to drop out. And why did they do that? It's because Joe Biden, by the time Super Tuesday was coming up, after South Carolina's results, it was clear Joe Biden was the only centrist, corporate-backed nominee left in the race that was going to be able to stop Sanders from being the nominee, because he was the only one who had any support among people of color. Buttigieg had basically none, same with Klobuchar. So they threw themselves on their sword, very unusually. Usually candidates will stay on as long as possible so they can have leverage going into the DNC. They sacrifice themselves and their campaigns to get Biden over the line against Sanders. Biden was really there mostly as a stop Sanders candidate. And I think they hoped that his polling against Trump would hold. And, it ultimately seems like it has, but at what price? The exact thing that they were worried about with Sanders, the idea that they were fear-mongering that Sanders was too extreme, he would bring down Democrats in down-ballot races, that he would ultimately hurt the prospects of having a Democratic Senate and holding the House. That is exactly what is happening with Biden now. His failure to turn out the vote and to get Latinos voting for Democrats in a whole host of parts around the country seem to have doomed, or at least contributed to, the loss of a whole bunch of Senate races that were looking pretty promising for Democrats at one point.
Well, yeah, and the centrist coalition that we were led to believe was going to be able to decisively beat Donald Trump, I mean, as far as these elites go, they completely failed. You can't make any other judgment. Like you look at the Lincoln Project and the money they were supposed to raise, and the one fundamental thing they said they were going to do is move Republicans who were disaffected with Trump or upset with Trump over to voting Biden. But it would seem that there were actually more GOP voters for Trump than back in 2016. So you truly have to question that. But I, the thing I have to ask you is one of the narratives I think we're going to hear from Democrats, aside from the routine blaming of the left that we can all expect to happen. I imagine that they're going to be saying that all of these ballots were mail in, like a lot of these ballots were mail in, and Biden would have won the election last night if it were the fact that they could have counted all of these ballots. And it may not be as messy as it is right now. So what do you say to that if they're, essentially invoking voter suppression or some of the kind of games that politically the Republicans were able to play in these swing states? I mean, it seems to me that you can't really put too much emphasis on that because at the end of this election, you still come away with a razor thin margin that shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, it may well be true that Biden would have taken it in a less messy election. But I mean, look at Wisconsin. Wisconsin was pegged by 538 to have, Biden was supposed to have a 8.4, I think, lead based on the polling averages in Wisconsin. He's ended up winning it. I mean, they're doing a recount, but as it stands now, he's ended up winning it by, I think, something like 1 point, maybe not even that. And we've seen this all around. Texas was meant to possibly even flip blue this election, and Biden's underperformance in a whole bunch of Latino counties, the majority of Latino counties in Texas, has completely washed that away. So, I think it would have been less messy than it is, but this is still a stunning result, especially when you consider the just scope of devastation and incompetence from Trump. We're looking at what, 230,000 something people dead at this point from COVID, from just a
Mm-hmm.
completely absent policy from the federal government. We're looking at economic devastation that hasn't been seen for nearly 100 years on an epic scale. We're looking at climate disaster on the West Coast on a scale that has, along with all the hurricanes and everything. I mean, this should be like when Reagan thumped Carter back in 1980, or when Roosevelt thumped Hoover back in 1932. This is such a massive crisis presided over and very much the fault of the incumbent that it should never have been this close. And you asked me before some of the difficulties that Biden was having that Democrats brought up in the primary and how it contributed to his loss. I mean, Biden famously was barely ever on the campaign trail, and that was that was seen by a lot of his supporters in the mainstream press and in the Democratic establishment. That was seen as an asset to his campaign, that voters did not see him, that voters would not be exposed to him, so they would not have their memory of him as Obama's vice president dashed by the man that he was now, someone who forgot names, constantly stumbled in his speech, seemed to sometimes forget what he was running for, droned on and kind of incomprehensible and baffling sentences. I mean, that forced Biden to do the hiding in the basement thing. And by the way, I'm sure there's going to be some stories that we're going to find out once this is all over about what exactly Biden was doing at certain times of the campaign. Why, when coronavirus hit, Biden just disappeared for an entire week and just wasn't visible. Why, in September, Biden took a third of the month off as campaign calling the lids sometimes as early as 9 in the morning, saying he will be doing nothing for the rest of the day. I eagerly await to find out whatever campaign gossip will explain that. But it was perhaps this scale of crisis was ultimately what needed to happen to put someone as flawed as Biden and to put someone with this bad a campaign strategy over the line. But even now, we see how razor thin that was, and I would be very hesitant to believe that this strategy is going to be able to work again in more normal times, let's say.
So there's just 2 points I want to make, and then I think we'll end on a larger note, addressing. I'd like to have you end addressing the collective failure of the media. But a lot of progressives, democratic socialists, people on the left, constantly were saying to the Biden campaign, and they can't pretend to be ignorant of it, that all you had to do was come out and support Medicare for all, and you would have a huge issue that would bring enthusiasm to your race, something to fight for and against Trump. And also, it fits the pandemic. It truly does, because you've got people who are being hit hard with these bills, I presume, from having to go to hospitals. And yet, they just insisted they were going to, in a very doctrinaire or kind of ideological way, cling to their own belief systems and not look at this as a means of defeating Donald Trump. And then there's also the fact that, it tends to be the case that people would say that we were dealing with right-wing populism, this is racism, this is xenophobia, but yet you've got Latinos and Black people considering Donald Trump, which I don't know if we can just write off their identities. And so I think you have to start to ask a question about how, as you were raising, how people viewed the Biden candidacy and whether he had his faculties and whether he could actually be someone who we entrust with the power to run this country from the White House. If he doesn't have the stamina, if he's taking all these breaks out of the campaign, is he healthy enough to run the country? And I think that, like, I haven't seen any analysis that factors in how people might have viewed whether he was capable and healthy enough to run the country. And that leads me to what I think we should conclude upon here, since both of us are part of the US press. I'm ashamed to be a part of this industry today. I'm ashamed because people handled Joe Biden with uh, kid gloves. They were so kind to him. His campaign had the best media any campaign could hope for, and yet they still didn't decisively beat Trump. I mean, I don't think Democrats are going to, in the history of this country, ever have such a favorable media going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Look at the response to Mike Pence's debate performance for what things are going to look like in the future. Mike Pence, who coolly lied his way through that debate, selling Trump's monstrous agenda, without blinking or hesitation, just flat out lied and created an alternate reality for himself. He was praised by people on MSNBC, by people like Bill Maher, and a whole bunch of other prominent Democratic supporters. As someone who, well, hey, look, you don't agree with him, but hey, at least he's not like Trump. At least he was, calm and collected and sane. And so I think it's going to be very easy for someone who is more capable and not as erratic and kind of out there as Trump to run on Trump's agenda in the future and beat a centrist Democrat if they sort of run the exact same strategy as they did this time. And you're right, the media coverage is going to be far more favorable to them, and perhaps more importantly, not nearly as favorable to Biden. This campaign has been it's been quite crazy to watch after 2016, where you can say the press was maybe too hard on Clinton over certain things, but I mean, I tend to think actually they were appropriately critical of her. They scrutinized her as they should. A major presidential candidate, someone who was everyone believed was going to be the president, and who had a number of legitimate scandals around her. And the press this time, even though it was the same exact case of Biden, and Biden also had some legitimate scandals around him, they not only coddled him and sort of tried to pull that under the rug, but they actually outright tried to delegitimize a legitimate story at the very end of the campaign because they were worried it was going to hurt him, which is the Hunter Biden, which I think we're gonna hear a lot more about if Biden does become president, because that does seem like a pretty serious potential scandal. And it's amazing to watch just the press corps of 2016 that attacked Clinton over not holding a press conference for however many days it was, to actually be cheering Biden on for avoiding them, for avoiding interviews, for not appearing in front of the press, for doing as few public appearances as possible. I don't think that's going to happen again, as you say. And what does it say about that campaign and about that party that in probably the most lenient treatment of a presidential candidate that we've seen in modern history, certainly that I can remember in my life, that even with that and with these terrible conditions, that he was only able to eke out this slim a victory. I think that is an indictment. I'm not sure if I've answered every part of your question there, but those are some of the thoughts that I've been mulling over.
I think it's good. Do you have any pause about the potential alliance between? You don't have to give a long answer to this. We can wrap up, but do you have any concerns about the potential alliance between these Silicon Valley companies and Joe Biden? Because it seems rather clear to me that they're going to be willing to censor people to actually help protect Joe Biden from potential chaos or conflicts that he might have to deal with. I mean, I don't know how I feel about what Donald Trump had to say on election night. He was talking about essentially they interpreted his tweet as a suggestion about stealing the election and ended up removing it from Twitter, was what Twitter did. But it also seems like, you know, that's something that the Biden administration and Democrats should rebut and repudiate and deal with. And this alliance between Democrats and Silicon Valley culturally seems to be the kind of thing that can inflame right-wing populism and really impact Democrats going forward.
Yeah, it could inflame right-wing populism, but also it'll affect anyone to the left of the corporate establishment of the Democratic Party. A Rubicon has been crossed. Doubt about that with this election, with Twitter and Facebook stepping in to stop the spread of a New York Post story that at the time was claimed to be about 5 different things. It was disinformation, it was forged, it was hacked, it was this, it was that. Since then, it's only become appeared more and more legitimate, and yet they stepped in to block it from being shared, from being read. They locked a major newspaper's account for publishing it, and it was all on baseless charges and to protect the candidate that they, not just financially support, but actually there's even staff overlap between some of these companies and the Biden campaign and the future Biden administration. And the danger there is you have to remember that the even though people said, well, this is a thing that media are doing and social media companies are doing during the presidential election because the stakes are so high that unfortunately, you have to stop negative stuff about Biden getting out because otherwise Trump wins and that's a disaster. I disagree with that formulation, but okay, sure, let's go with that. The problem there is that it didn't start with Trump. This started way back when it was still a primary contest between Sanders, who of course ran a campaign that was against oligarchs, against the billionaire class, people like the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who backed Biden. And at the time, of course, we had the Tara Reade scandal, the sexual assault allegation against Biden, which, again, something that had, as the story was reported on more and more, gained more and more corroboration, much more than actually a number of other allegations that I think and a lot of other people think are legitimate against Trump. And yet, that story was, in a similar way as the Hunter Biden email story, was delegitimized by the press. I've heard, I can't confirm this, but I've heard that there is also that there's some social media censorship around posting of that scandal leading up to the election. It's not that difficult to imagine another primary contest in 4 years' time or 8 years' time, what have you, where you have a corporate centrist who is backed by Silicon Valley or some other faction of the billionaire class, and is being challenged by an insurgent progressive or leftist who say wants to break up tech monopolies or tax billionaires or what have you. And again, a scandal rears its head in a crucial point in the primary that is bad for the corporate centrist. And these companies, which have now opened the door to censoring stories on very flimsy charges, step in and again, censor it, suppress it, so that this candidate ends up winning. And then, maybe you end up with another result like this, where the centrist goes up against the far right candidate and underperforms. It's a very scary thing, not just because of what censorship can mean for people like us, people who are the more independent side of media, but also for what it means just in terms of politics more generally.
All right, well, Branko, thank you for joining me about this catastrophe and this utter mess. Everybody who went through this, I think, is really terribly angry. And there's a lot of questions I think the Democratic Party is going to have to answer for. And I think, we're part of a group that's going to continue to force them, although be futile, to take some responsibility for what's going on. And so yeah, you're an In These Times fellow. Also, just so if people want to follow you, they can find your account here on Twitter, and that's where you'll find the thread. You did a rundown of some of your observations about the election results, and you're the author of Yesterday's Man: The Case Against Joe Biden. So thanks again for joining us. Okay.